the front door slammed against the wall so hard that the framed pictures rattled. I had just set down a basket of folded laundry when the heavy footsteps came closer, fast and angry. "Mom, what did you do?" Nathan's voice echoed through the hallway before I even saw him. He appeared in the doorway, his face flushed red, green eyes blazing in the way they used to when he was a teenager. "Harper just called me in tears," he said, his voice shaking with rage. "You changed the password on your card." She was standing at the store, everyone staring while her card got declined. She was humiliated. I kept my hands steady even though my heart was racing. "Nathan," I said, my tone calm, "it is my card, my money. I'm not obligated to leave it open for anyone else to use." He threw his hands in the air. "We're family. Harper was buying groceries and cleaning supplies, Mom. You made her look like a fool." The words hit me harder than I expected, not because of the accusation, but because of the contempt behind them. For 34 years I had raised that boy, carried him, loved him, sacrificed for him. And now he stood before me as if I were some stranger keeping him from what he believed was rightfully his. I took a deep breath and straightened my shoulders. "Lower your tone, Nathan. We can talk about this like adults. But my finances are not a family service." His jaw tightened. He stepped closer, close enough for me to see the sweat forming along his hairline. For the first time I felt something new: fear. Not fear of being hurt, but fear of what our relationship had become. The space between us felt wider than the ocean, wide enough to make my own son look like a stranger. I remembered the nights I had worked double shifts at Memorial Hospital after Robert died. I remembered the exhaustion, the empty chair at the dinner table, the silence I filled by promising myself it would all be worth it. Nathan's voice cut through the memory. "You're overreacting, Mom. Harper needed that card for necessities. You can't just pull it away." I met his eyes. "I can, Nathan, and I will if it means setting boundaries." The house grew quiet, the kind of quiet that hums with unfinished anger. The laundry basket still sat in the hallway, forgotten. But something far heavier had just been dropped between us, the realization that this fight was not about a password. It was about respect, control, and how much of myself I had already given away. That night, after Nathan left, I couldn't sleep. The house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of cicadas outside my window. I sat at the kitchen table, the dim light above casting long shadows across the walls. I thought about everything that had led us here. After Robert died, I went back to work within a week. Bills didn't wait for grief. I picked up every double shift I could at Memorial Hospital. Some nights I'd come home as the sun rose, too tired to eat, but I'd still make breakfast for Nathan before school. When he got accepted into college, I sold Robert's old truck to help pay the tuition that the scholarships didn't cover. Every dollar I earned went toward keeping his life stable. I told myself it was worth it, that someday he would look back and understand what it cost me. When Nathan met Harper, I saw that spark in his eyes again, the same one he had as a boy whenever he discovered something new and exciting. She was charming, polite, the kind of woman who knew how to make an impression. The first time she came to dinner, she complimented everything I cooked and called me Mom, with a sweetness that could melt butter. Back then, I truly believed she would be the daughter I never had. It started small, so small it felt harmless. "We're a little short this month, Mrs. Sinclair," she'd say softly, glancing at Nathan like she was embarrassed. "Could we borrow $200? We'll pay you back Friday." Friday always came and went, and the money never did. But I didn't press. They were young, starting out, and I wanted to help. That's what family does, or at least that's what I told myself. Then the amounts grew. 200 became 5. 5 became 8. There was always a reason, always a new emergency. And I kept saying yes. I told myself it was love. I told myself that one day when they stood on their own feet, they'd remember who helped them up. But sitting there in the quiet with the shadows creeping across my kitchen floor, I realized something I had never allowed myself to think before. Love had turned into obligation, and obligation had turned into debt. A few days later, I went to my bedroom closet to look through the small lockbox I kept tucked beneath a pile of winter sweaters. Inside were the fragments of a life, Robert's will, the deed to the house, a few old photographs, and the insurance papers I still hadn't brought myself to organize. As I thumbed through the folders, something unusual caught my eye. A folded sheet of paper sat wedged between my passport and a stack of medical forms. I unfolded it, expecting to find an old bill or maybe a note I'd forgotten about. But it wasn't a note. It was a photocopy of my credit card, both sides. The numbers, the expiration date, even the security code on the back. And there at the bottom, written in Harper's looping handwriting, were 3 small words: for emergencies only. My breath caught in my throat. The room seemed to tilt slightly as I read the words again and again, trying to make sense of them. For emergencies only. I sat on the edge of my bed, the paper trembling in my hands. There it was, the proof I had been afraid to look for. Harper hadn't just borrowed my card, she had made a permanent copy of it. I waited until evening when I knew Nathan would be home from work, and I called him. He sounded annoyed even before I spoke. "Nathan," I said, "I need to talk to you. It's important." He came over that night, standing in my living room with his arms crossed like a man forced into a conversation he didn't want. I handed him the paper. "Do you recognize this?" He'd barely glanced at it before letting out a sigh. "Mom, you're imagining things again? Harper would never do that. Maybe you gave her permission and just forgot?" "I didn't forget," I said quietly. "Her handwriting is right there, Nathan. Look at it." He pushed the paper back toward me as if it burned his fingers. "You've been stressed lately. Maybe you should let someone else handle your accounts before you make a real mistake." For a moment I couldn't speak. I had faced angry patients, hospital emergencies, and nights of pure exhaustion, but nothing hurt like hearing my own son question my sanity. When he left, the house felt colder than ever. The silence wasn't peace, it was disbelief settling in my bones. 2 days passed before I saw them again. The doorbell rang just after lunch, and when I opened it, Nathan and Harper were standing on my porch. Both were smiling, the kind of smile that hides something sharp beneath it. "Mom," Nathan began, his tone overly gentle, "we came to make peace." Harper nodded quickly, her voice soft and polished. "We just want to make sure things don't get confusing anymore. You've done so much for us, and we don't ever want money to come between family." I stayed quiet, waiting. Nathan took a breath and continued. "We thought maybe it would be easier if we set up a system. You could transfer a fixed amount every month, say $1,500. That way we'd never have to bother you again, and you'd know exactly what to expect." Harper clasped her hands as if she were doing me a kindness. "It would save you the stress of questions or surprise expenses. Everyone wins." For a long moment I said nothing. The audacity of it stunned me. $1,500 was nearly my entire Social Security check. They weren't trying to ease my burden, they were trying to own it. I shook my head slowly. "No, Nathan, I won't agree to that." The patience on his face vanished, his jaw clenched, his voice low and tight. "Mom, you're being unreasonable. Harper and I are trying to build a future, and you're making it harder. If you don't want to help us willingly—" He hesitated, then looked me straight in the eye. "Maybe the court should decide if you're capable of managing your own money." For a second I couldn't breathe. "What are you saying?" I whispered. He didn't flinch. "It's called guardianship. It would protect you from mistakes. We'd just handle things for you." The boy I had raised, the one I'd held through fevers, fed through nights of hunger, was threatening to take away my freedom. My voice trembled, but I forced it steady. "Get out of my house." They left quietly, their soft perfume and false concern lingering long after the door shut. I stood there alone, the sunlight spilling across the floor, and I knew that whatever this was, it had just turned into a battle I couldn't fight by myself. That night I sat at the kitchen table staring at the cold cup of tea in front of me. The word guardianship echoed in my head until it started to lose its meaning. I had always thought battles ended when your children grew up. I was wrong. The next morning I crossed the street to visit my neighbor, Elaine Cooper. She had lived there for more than 20 years, a retired English teacher with sharp eyes and a kind heart. She took one look at my face and opened the door wider. "Come in, Audrey. Sit down. Tell me what happened." I told her everything, the arguments, the card, the photocopy, the threats. When I finished, she sat back, silent for a long time. Then she said, quietly but firmly, "You're not losing your mind, Audrey. You're being targeted." Her certainty hit me harder than any insult Nathan had thrown at me. "Targeted," I repeated, the word tasting bitter. Elaine leaned forward. "I've watched them for years. Harper is polite when she needs to be, but her eyes give her away. This isn't confusion or family tension. This is control. They've been grooming you for this moment." I wanted to argue, to defend my son, but the words wouldn't come. Deep down, I knew she was right. "What do I do?" I whispered. "You fight," she said simply, "and you don't fight alone. I know someone, Daniel Whitmore. He's an attorney downtown. He helps people when families cross lines like this." I hesitated. An attorney? I've never needed one. Elaine reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. "You need one now." That afternoon, she drove me to Daniel's office herself. As the city skyline rose ahead of us, I realized that for the first time in a long time, I wasn't walking into fear, I was walking towards something that looked like hope. Daniel Whitmore's office was a quiet place with old wood panels and the smell of coffee that had been brewed hours ago. He looked to be in his late 50s, tall, calm, and steady, the kind of man who listened with his full attention. When I told him everything, he didn't interrupt. He took notes, asked clear questions, and finally said, "Mrs. Sinclair, I've handled cases like this before. What your son and daughter-in-law are trying to do is financial exploitation, and we're going to stop it." He asked for access to my bank statements and credit reports. I went home that night feeling something I hadn't felt in months: relief. Someone finally believed me. A week later, Daniel called me back to his office. I sat across from him as he opened a folder thick with documents. His expression was controlled, but I could see the anger behind his eyes. "Here's what we found," he said. "Over the last 10 months, nearly $25,000 were withdrawn from your savings account. 3 credit cards were opened in your name and linked to Nathan's home address. The purchases include restaurant bills, clothing stores, and travel bookings." I stared at the papers spread out before me. Each number felt like a bruise I hadn't known was there. Daniel's voice softened. "It's a pattern, Audrey. They've been using your identity to fund their life." 2 weeks later, I found myself walking through the heavy doors of the Charleston County Courthouse. The ceilings were high, the marble floor cold under my shoes. Elaine sat beside me for support while Daniel reviewed his notes. Across the aisle, Nathan and Harper were whispering with a young lawyer who looked barely out of school. When the hearing began, their attorney painted a picture of me as a confused, aging woman who could no longer handle her own affairs. "Mrs. Sinclair is forgetful," he said smoothly. "She's making false accusations out of stress and loneliness. My clients only want to help her." Nathan took the stand, his voice calm, practiced. "She's not the mother I grew up with," he said. "She forgets things, gets angry for no reason, accuses us of stealing. We just want her to be safe." Harper dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, a perfect performance. Then Daniel stood. His tone was measured, almost gentle, but every word landed with precision. He laid out the evidence: bank statements showing withdrawals I never made, letters from credit companies addressed to Nathan's address, and the photocopy of my card with Harper's handwriting on it. He even called my doctor to testify that my neurological and cognitive exams were normal for my age. The courtroom fell silent. The judge flipped through the documents, his expression unreadable. Seconds stretched into minutes before he finally spoke. "This court finds Mrs. Audrey Sinclair fully competent to manage her affairs," he said. "The guardianship petition is denied. Restitution of $25,000 is ordered, fraudulent accounts are to be canceled, and direct contact is prohibited for 1 year." The gavel struck once. It was over. Elaine squeezed my hand and Daniel gave a small, satisfied nod. I should have felt victorious, but my eyes drifted toward Nathan. He didn't look at me. His shoulders were tense, his gaze fixed on the floor. I had won the case. My money, my dignity, my independence, all safe again. But as I left the courtroom, the weight in my chest told me the truth. I had lost something else entirely, the part of me that still believed my son would ever come back. The next morning, I came home carrying the court papers that proved I had won. I placed them on the dining table beside a vase of magnolias from my garden. Sunlight poured through the window, soft and golden, touching everything but the empty chairs around me. For years, I had imagined those chairs filled with laughter, Nathan at the head of the table, Harper passing a bowl of mashed potatoes, maybe even a grandchild one day tugging at my sleeve. Now they sat silent, reminders of what used to be possible. I made dinner that evening anyway, out of habit more than hunger. 1 plate, 1 fork, 1 glass. I set them on the table and stared at the empty space across from me. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking every second of a house too quiet to feel alive. Freedom had been restored, but it didn't feel like freedom. It felt like standing in the ruins of something I had spent my whole life building. I walked through each room, touching the furniture Robert and I had chosen together, the framed photos of Nathan as a boy, the dent on the hallway wall where he once crashed his bike. Every corner carried a memory, but none of them could answer the question that haunted me now: how does a mother stop loving her child? I didn't have an answer. That night, I sat in the old armchair by the window, the same chair where I used to cradle Nathan when he had fevers. The moonlight touched the edges of the court documents on the table. I had fought for my name, my sanity, my right to live on my own terms, and I had won. But victory can feel a lot like loneliness when the people you love most become strangers. I closed my eyes and whispered a prayer, not for justice this time, but for peace. Days passed, then weeks. The house stayed quiet, but the silence no longer hurt quite as much. I began to find comfort in small things: the hum of the kettle in the morning, the soft rustle of the magnolia leaves outside my window, the smell of coffee filling the kitchen as the sun came up. Daniel checked in from time to time. At first he came strictly for updates on the restitution payments, to make sure the court's orders were being followed. But every visit lasted a little longer than the one before. He'd linger by the porch, asking about my garden, or stay for a second cup of coffee. One afternoon he brought me a book he thought I'd enjoy, a collection of short stories about resilience. "You remind me of the women in these pages," he said with a quiet smile. I found myself smiling back, something I hadn't done easily in months. We started to talk about more than court cases, about books, about Robert, about his late wife and the years he'd spent learning to live again. He had a way of listening that made the silence feel safe. And for the first time, the house didn't echo with loss. It breathed with presence. I realized I didn't dread mornings anymore. I'd wake up, open the curtains, and think of what I might plant next in the garden. The magnolias were beginning to bloom early that year, their pale petals soft as hope itself. Maybe this was what healing looked like: not loud or sudden, but quiet and steady, like a garden learning to grow again after the frost. And in that quiet, I began to feel something I hadn't dared to believe in for a long time: peace that didn't come from anyone else, but from within myself. Spring arrived early that year. The air in Charleston turned warm and soft, carrying the scent of magnolia blossoms and salt from the river. One morning, as I watered the roses, Daniel stopped by with a small smile and an uncharacteristic nervousness in his eyes. He held out a single magnolia bloom. "You once told me this flower meant dignity," he said quietly. "I was hoping you'd let me share that with you, for the rest of our lives." I laughed, a gentle, disbelieving sound. After everything that had happened, the betrayal, the loneliness, the courtroom battles, I hadn't imagined love could still find me. But it had, in the most ordinary way, standing under the same oak trees that had shaded my home for decades. We married the April in my backyard, beneath those oaks draped with Spanish moss. Elaine stood as my witness, proud and tearful. There was no music, no crowd, no grandeur. Just us, the soft rustle of leaves and the scent of magnolias in bloom. I wore a simple blue dress I had owned for years. Daniel read his vows from a small notebook, his voice steady but full of feeling. When it was my turn, I told him that life had taken much from me, but it had also given me one more chance to choose peace. As we exchanged rings, I felt the weight of the past lift piece by piece. The anger, the grief, the disappointment, they no longer owned me. Sometimes you must lose everything to find what truly matters. And in that moment, standing under the golden light of late afternoon, surrounded by flowers I had tended with my own hands, I realized that what mattered most was not what I had lost, but what I had finally learned to keep. Love your children deeply, but never let love blind you to respect. Generosity without boundaries becomes permission for abuse, and silence often costs more than peace. If life ever forces you to choose between your dignity and someone else's comfort, choose dignity. It may hurt, but it will set you free. My name is Audrey Sinclair, and this is my story, a reminder that strength isn't about fighting louder, it's about standing quietly when the world expects you to fall. If this story touched you, share and tell me in the comments what would you have done.